I want to welcome you to the October 1st message here at Meadowbrook Baptist Church called The God Who Hears and Sees Me. Residents of the small coastal town of Florence, Oregon, woke up to a whale of a problem on November 9th, 1970. Literally a whale of a problem. An employee of Oregon State Highway Division in charge of maintaining the Oregon state beaches at that time made a gruesome discovery of a dead 45-foot long, 8-ton sperm whale that had died and washed up on the beach several hundred yards south of the small coastal town of Florence, Oregon. The huge decaying whale was smelling terribly, it was putrid, and the smell was spreading fast. Officials of the Oregon State Highway Division didn't know what the proper procedures for getting rid of such a large decaying whale, because no one could remember the last time such a thing had happened. So engineers with the Highway Division began discussing what would be the best way to get rid of the smelling, decaying carcass. Some suggested the option of just burying it there, the whale there on the beach, but then they decided that the tides would eventually erode away the sand, and there the smell, it would just be it would start smelling again. Others said, well, why would we just leave the whale there and let it decay, let nature take its course? But they determined that it would take several years and the stench would be just too much. Another suggested cutting up the decaying whale and burying it elsewhere, but then no one thought that they would want to be the one to volunteer to do that job. Then, finally, one engineer suggested blowing up the dead whale with dynamite, blowing it to smithereens, and then it would be blown out to sea. Where the seagulls and crabs would eat up the decaying corpse, and problem solved. The engineer, George Thornton, was interviewed on the news and said, well, I'm confident it will work. The only thing is, we're not sure how much explosive it will take to disintegrate this thing. A retired military demolition expert said you'll probably only need about 20 sticks of dynamite. But instead, the engineers thought they knew better and decided to bury 20 cases of dynamite on the landward side of the whale. They figured that the massive blast would explode the decaying whale and blast the pieces out into the ocean. Finally, the day came on Sunday afternoon, November the 12th. A sizable crowd of curious onlookers and local media gathered to witness and record on film for posterity the demolition and disposition of the dead whale. The crowd was cordoned off at what they considered a safe distance of a quarter mile from the blast zone. Then at 3:45 on cue, the dynamite on the landward side that had been buried underneath the whale's blubbery belly was detonated, and but instead of blasting the whale to smithereens and blasting it out to sea, instead, the debris went straight up in the air, and blood, guts, and other stuff unmentionable went flying through the air towards the crowd, and the onlookers, the spectators, ran in terror as they were being pelted by pieces of meat and blubber and being sprayed with blood. On top of that, a large chunk of the whale, and it landed on a brand new 1970 Oldsmobile and flattened it. Instead of blowing the whale to smithereens, about half of the whale was left behind. Needless to say, the solution to the problem to this, it didn't solve the mess, but just made the mess bigger. The smell, since the debris went everywhere, the smell spread with the debris. The original solution did not work, but only created a bigger mess. They wound up burying the whale remains that were there and so forth. We're all familiar with messes, from spilt milk to the dog that had been outside tracking mud throughout the house on the brand new carpet, or kids spilling their juice or their Coke on the floor and so forth. We're also, this past summer, there were several of these infamous highway spills. One occurred in North Carolina, Lenoir, North Carolina, back in June on Highway 11, when a tanker truck hauling tar overturned and burst open, emptying the tar all over the highway. You talk about a mess. That was a mess. Then in July, just outside of Prescott, Arkansas, on Interstate 30, a big truck hauling hundreds of cans of nacho cheese. The trailer turned over, and cans of nacho cheese busted open all over Interstate 30. Chips, anyone? It was a big mess. And on you hear about these man-made messes, from nacho cheese to tar and whale blubber. We have messes, and that's one thing, to have a mess like that, and eventually it's cleaned up, and the smell even goes away. But this morning, I want us to think about messes that we make in our personal life. Huge messes. Messes that we have all made and in our lives, because we've all sinned. We've made a mess out of things. And we go all the way back to Adam and Eve, we find these messes. In fact, Abraham and Sarah, that we've been looking at the last few weeks, they made their share of messes. And they made a big one here in Genesis 16 as they tried to, quote unquote, help God out. In fact, they wound up hurting a lot of people, and the effects of their mess last today. But what I want us to focus on is that in spite of and in the midst of these messes, we find that God still is looking for us. He still cares about us. He hears us, and he sees us. Let's read Genesis 16 as we look at the God who sees and hears and helps us. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children, but she had an Egyptian slave named Hagar. So she said to Abram, "The Lord has kept me from having children. Go sleep with my slave. Perhaps I can build a family through her." Well, Abram agreed to what Sarai said. So after Abram had been living in Canaan 10 years, Sarai, his wife, took her Egyptian slave Hagar and gave her to her husband to be his wife. She slept with Hagar, and she conceived. When she knew she was pregnant, she began to despise her mistress. Then Sarai said to Abram, "You are responsible for the wrong I am suffering. I put my slave in your arms, and now that she knows she is pregnant, she despises me. May the Lord judge between you and me." "Your slave is in your hands," Abram said. "Do with her whatever you think best." Then Sarai mistreated Hagar, so she fled from her. And the angel of the Lord found Hagar near a spring in the desert. It was the spring that is beside the road to Shur. And he said, "Hagar, slave of Sarai, where have you come from, and where are you going?" I'm running away from my mistress, Sarai, she answered. Then the angel of the Lord told her, "Go back to your mistress and submit to her." The angel added, "I will increase your descendants so much that they will be too numerous to count." And the angel of the Lord also said to her, "You are now pregnant, and you will give birth to a son, and you shall name him Ishmael, for the Lord has heard of your misery. He will be a wild donkey of a man. His hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand against him, and he will live in hostility toward all his brothers." She gave this name to the Lord, who spoke to her, "You are the God who sees me." For she said, "I have now seen the one who sees me." That's why the well was called Bir Lahai-roi. It's still there between Kadesh and Bered. So Hagar bore Abram a son, and Abram gave him the name Ishmael to the son she had born. And Abraham was 86 years old when Hagar bore him Ishmael. I'm sure everyone here has been witness to and the cause of perhaps both minor and major messes. If you want a real mess, try what happened to me one time when I knocked off a brand new 2-liter of Coke off the top of the refrigerator, and it burst open and it exploded everywhere. A sticky mess. I Googled a mess and found an article named "How to Make a Mess in 17 Steps." Believe me, I don't need to read about how to make a mess. I could write a book myself. There are many ways to make a mess, but spiritually speaking, we are all experts at making messes. When we do things our own way instead of trusting God and believing and trusting His promises and His way. We think we've got to help God out, just like Sarai did here, and Abram, which is last week we thought, it's done. As we saw how Abram was having to deal with some doubts and fears and how, I'm this old that we still don't have any children. And God took him outside and said, "Look up at the stars. Count the stars if you can, so shall your offspring be." And Abraham believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness. But time continued to go on by, and still no child. Here in chapter 16, Sarai said, "Here, take my Egyptian slave named Hagar, and sleep with her." She says, "The Lord has kept me from having children. Go sleep with my slave. Perhaps I can build a family through her." Now, Hagar, her name, by the way, means fleeing. And we read in the account here how Hagar actually hit the road when in the middle of this mess. And perhaps, she just wanted to get out of there. She fled. But her name means fleeing. She was given to Abram and Sarai when they were down in Egypt, which should ring a bell of another time when Abram thought he knew best, and instead of trusting God to take care of him and his flocks up there during the middle of a famine in Israel, he went down to Egypt to the Nile River, and of course that was when he said, "Sarai is my sister," because she was so beautiful and was afraid Pharaoh would kill him so he could take his wife to be his own. And that turned into a mess. But here we see that while they were down in Egypt, evidently they picked up or had given to them this Egyptian handmaiden, this slave to Sarai. And now she becomes involved in this mess as not of her own choosing, but Sarah feels like, hey, I need to help God out. In fact, she even blames God. Notice she said, "The Lord has kept me from having children." The Lord, He's the one to blame. And she said, take my handmaiden and sleep with her, and perhaps I can build a house or a family through her. Now, actually, this practice of was legal in their days, in their culture. The Code of Hammurabi from the Middle East there at the time said that if you were barren, if your wife was barren, you can take your female slave of your wife and have a child through her, and that child would then be considered the son of the husband and wife, and would be a legal heir. And but that was not God's way. That was not God's promise. God's promise was that to do the impossible, to enable Sarah to have a child. But still, sometimes we think, well, we need to do it our way. I know God's word says this, but maybe the phrase that Benjamin Franklin coined, God helps those who help themselves. Maybe we need to help God out. That's not in the Bible. That's not a Bible verse. So 81% of Americans think God helps those who help themselves, that comes from the Bible. No, it's not in there. The Lord is the one who has the power to do the impossible and fulfilling his promises, and we need to trust and obey him and follow his plan rather than trying to take things into our own hands. Every time we do that, you're going to make a big mess. Then it kind of reminds me of Adam and Eve. They made a big mess. Instead of trusting God's provision, and they were in the very presence of God and everything they needed, but instead they distrusted God. They were deceived, and they made a big mess. Of course, listen to Abram. Oh, he said he agreed to what Sarah said, and and what happened? Hagar got pregnant, and when Hagar got pregnant, she figured out she had the pole position. She was the top woman now because she was able to get pregnant. And she did start not listening to Sarah and despised her, which caused another problem. The mess, instead of making things get better, the mess gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And she blamed Abraham, saying, "You are responsible for the wrong I'm suffering, and now she despises me." Man, you're going to try to figure that out. You thought you were doing what your wife wanted you to do, but you knew that you shouldn't be doing it, but you did it anyway. But because she wanted you to do it, you did it, and now she's blaming you for doing what she wanted you to do. They had a mess on their hands. And in reality, of course, Hagar gives birth to, as we read, Ishmael. And our world still is suffering the effects of that mess. In fact, the mess just gets bigger and bigger and bigger when we try to do things our own. Sarah says, what are you going to do about it? And Abram says, your slave is in your own hands. Do whatever you think is best. A problem with that, they should have been saying, what does God want? It's not whatever we think is best. It's what God thinks is best. And, Sarah began mistreating Hagar. Was that God's plan? Absolutely not. And we see that Hagar then flees, as her name says. She flees from Sarah, her the owner, so to speak, because she's being mistreated. And she she makes her way, this young pregnant woman makes her way by herself towards Egypt until she comes to a well or a fountain on the road to Shur. Now, she was a pregnant single mother out in the middle of nowhere. And she comes to this well to get a drink. I mean, she's thirsty. This is in the middle of the wilderness desert on the road to Shur. Now, Shur, that word S-H-U-R means wall. It was kind of like the northeastern boundary or wall of the country of Egypt. Shur. She's going back home. I mean, she is crying out in despair. She didn't know what to do. She just wanted to go back to Egypt. Have you ever found yourself in the middle of a mess? I mean, obviously not like this, perhaps, but a mess, and you feel like you're out in the middle of nowhere by yourself, and no one cares, and you're wondering, how in the world? You just want to go home. But verse 7 says, the angel of the Lord, and by the way, this is the first time in the Bible that the angel of Yahweh, literally the word angel is the Hebrew word Malik, which means messenger, the messenger of the Lord. Now, sometimes people think this is a pre-incarnate theophany or appearance of a Christophany, appearance of Jesus Christ in the Old Testament. We don't know that. We know that the messenger represented the Lord. In those days, if a messenger of a king went, it was as the king, they were carrying the king's word, and it was as if the king was present. So it's not necessarily saying, as we'll see later, that the Lord himself appeared, as in Jesus Christ, but an angel of the Lord from heaven appears. And it's amazing. Whenever there's a major birth announcement, you find in the Bible an angel of the Lord showing up and then giving the name. But I wanted to key in here first. It says the angel of the Lord, the angel of the Lord found Hagar. The angel of the Lord found Hagar. That means the angel of the Lord was looking. He had come on the mission to find this young woman in the middle of a mess, something that wasn't God's plan, but God came to her. An Egyptian woman, not Israel, not a descendant of Abraham, a relative of Abraham, but God comes for all people in the middle of their mess, single mothers, people in prison, people that their lives are torn apart. He comes looking for all of us. We've all made a mess or find ourselves in the middle of a mess, and the Lord comes looking for us. He cares for us. He comes looking for us, and he sees Hagar, and he asks her, "Where are you coming?" And he knows her. Listen, Hagar, he addressed her, Hagar, slave of Sarah. Where have you come from and where are you going? The Lord knew her name. The Lord already knew where she came from, Sarah, but he was trying to help her to be able to share with him what was going on. He had already heard and saw her, and he came looking for her. And he tells her to go back and submit to Sarah. God had a plan. And we see that the angel Lord gives the Lord's promise here, I will increase your descendants so much that they will be too numerous to count. Hagar had found herself in the middle of a mess, but God saw her in the middle of that mess. He came looking for her, and he appointed this woman, the slave woman, single mother, rejected by Sarah, abandoned by the father of her baby, Abram. And there she's out there, but God came looking for her with a promise. God extends his promise to us in the middle of our messes. And he says, your descendants through Ishmael, this baby, you're pregnant with this baby, and he is going to have a multitude of descendants. He says, you're pregnant, and you are to give him the name Ishmael. Ishmael. which means God hears, because the Lord has heard. And the Lord hears us, whether you're Hagar in the middle of nowhere and you're sitting down by this whale, I'm still thinking about that stinking whale. And he hears you, and he extends the promise to you. Now, along with this promise, the thing is, when we make a mess, we make a big mess. And the mess, just like Adam and Eve's sin spread, so this mess spread. And Ishmael, he said, he's going to have a multitude of descendants, but he's going to be in hostility to all of his brothers. He's going to be a wild donkey of a man. He's going to be out of control, and he's going to have a lot of enemies. And he's going to be an enemy of his brothers, talking about the Israelites and the descendants of Abraham. And that's the way it is today. That's why, we have 9/11. Partially, that's part of the reason there. And everything is because the mess continues. But God comes to us in the midst of our mess, forgiving us, promising us, calling us by name to go to be part of what He's doing and to experience His promises for our lives. He heard Hagar. He hears you. But on top of that, we see Hagar had a life-changing experience. The angel Lord comes to her and he finds her, but in the process, she finds the Lord. She called out the Lord. It says who spoke to her, the Lord who spoke to her. And here's another thing: God speaks a word, will speak to you in the middle of your mess if you'll listen to Him. He comes to you, He hears you, and He sees you. And that's what amazed Hagar, because she says, "You are the God who sees me." A lot of times we like to imagine, nobody can see me. Maybe sometimes nobody can see what I'm doing wrong, but a lot of times we're hurting and we're in this mess, and we say nobody cares or sees or hears me. But Hagar realized, you are the God who sees me. And that's the one true God, the Lord, the great I am. He is omnipotent, omnipresent, omniscient. He knows all, and He sees you and He hears you. And she says, you're the God who sees me. You see me. How'd you know I would be? Because He cares. And she went on to say, I have now seen the one who sees me. In the midst of her trials and misery, she said, the Lord sees me. You are the God who sees me, she told this angel of the Lord. Have you come to a point in your life and you wonder, how did I wind up in such a mess? Hagar knew that her cries were not unheard but heard, and she was not unseen, but she is not only being seen, but watched over. And she said, I've seen the one who sees me. And verse 14 says, that is why the well is called Beer Lahai Roi. Moses, who wrote these first 5 books of the Bible, he mentions that the well Beer Lahai Roi is still there today between Bered and Kadesh. He had drunk at that well. He had heard how 400 years earlier, this woman, he said it's still there. And Beer Lahai Roi, by the way, in Springfield, there's a Christian ministry to, it's either unwed pregnant women or women in crisis that, they go there for shelter and safety, and they name it Beer Lahai Roi. And which means the well of the living one who sees me. He's alive, the Lord is real, and He sees you. Hey, we've all made messes, but the Lord sees and hears us in the midst of our misery and the messes that we make. It says that Abram was 86 years old when Hagar gave birth to a son, and he named him Ishmael. Hagar said, God, I've met him. I've met the God you've been talking about, the one who sees me. And and the angel said to call this baby, the Lord hears. God hears me. Imagine as Hagar was raising that boy, every time it was time for supper, she said, Ishmael. But really, in Hebrew, she's saying, God hears me, God hears me, God hears, come here, God hears me. And, on and on. She was reminded, God does hear. He sees me, and he cares about me. We need to stop trying to fix our messes with our own solutions. Think we know, I know better than experts. I know that you should do this, but I think this will work. We need to listen to and follow and trust and obey God and His promises. Otherwise, we have a big, stinking, smelly mess. But know that the Lord loves you and He hears you and He sees you, and you can call upon Him and trust in His promises today.